So wintertime fishing. Wintertime fishing, there's no doubt about it. It can be very, very intimidating. Mostly because the conditions are usually harsh. I mean, this is usually very unfavorable for fishing. And most everything that everybody's going to ever tell you about wintertime fishing is slow down, drag something on the bottom, slow down. And depending on where you're from and what part of the country you're from, nothing can be farther than the truth. When the water dips into the low 50s, 40s, that's when I like to throw reaction baits, moving baits. And of course, there is nothing better to fish than a rattle trap during that time of the year. I like to throw crankbaits and things like that, but there's a couple of different reasons that I think a rattle trap shines much better than any other crankbait during the early winter periods. There it goes, stud right there, boy. I've had bites 3 times in a row, and I finally got one. I picked that thing up and drop it, and I finally got one to take it and grab it. That is a good fish right there. That's a good way to start off the morning. So just for starters, the rattle trap is a bait that we all know you can cover tons and tons of water. It casts really well in wind. You can throw it a long way, and typically you're going to kind of fish it a little fast, so that makes it a good bait to cover water with. And a lot of times in the wintertime, fish stack up in these little wintering holes or depressions, little creek turn bends, rock piles, places like that. So there's a lot of dead water out there. So in order to find those places, you got to cover a lot of water. That's one reason a rattle trap is so good. You can cover a lot of water and fish a lot of dead territory until you get into one of those sweet spots, a creek channel bend, a rock pile, any of that kind of structure where fish typically winter can get there a lot faster if you're fishing a trap. One of my favorite reasons to fish a rattle trap is you can contact the bottom really, really well. Especially in the wintertime, I like to fish around rocks. When I'm fishing around rocks, I can keep in contact with the rattle trap a whole lot better than I can when I'm fishing a square bill crankbait or some type of floating type of crankbait. If I slow down with the crankbait, the bait's going to have a tendency to kind of back off of the structure. If I need to slow down, it's a little bit harder to get the bait down to the structure. However, if I'm fishing with a rattle trap, it's a sinking bait. So when I cast it out and I want to hit a rock pile or some type of submerged structure, I can work that bait really, really slow once I find that sweet spot that I want to fish, and I can keep in contact with it because it's a sinking bait. So it deflects a little bit differently off of structure than a crankbait. When I fish a crankbait, the bait likes to run over, it runs off the structure, and it takes a little bit of time for it to track back and run true. But when I'm fishing a rattle trap, the bait just ricochets off of totally different than a crankbait. It's a little bit more erratic, it's a little bit more unpredictable, and sometimes that's the key to getting the bite, is when you can actually get something that's a little bit more erratic, a little bit more unpredictable. That's how you can trick those fish into biting. Typically when you think about fishing a rattle trap, you're thinking about fishing around grass or some type of aquatic vegetation, but by far, fishing in a hard structure like rocks, there's nothing better than a rattle trap because of the way that it deflects off of the structure is totally different than any other bait. Of course, my favorite colors during this time of the year are the old standbys, the crawl colors. When I'm in the early fall, I like to use some of the shad patterns. But when I get into the winter time, it's usually, most of the time, my bite is going to be more around crawl patterns, typically because I'm going to be using my bait to hit the bottom a little bit more consistently when I'm fishing in the winter time. Look what he did. So what there's just a little creek turn that comes in on this point here, and there's some big boulders out there. A lot of people talk about traps. When you think about rattle traps, all you think about is grass, but it's candy crawl. They love to fish rattle traps around rocks. Rocks are really good. They deflect off those rocks really good. That bait will shimmy off those rocks. That's what happened. First cast up there on those boulders, the bass came up there and got it. Let's get out there. During the winter time, fish tend to group up in small groups. They're not really scattered out along the bank. So you got to cover a lot of water in order to find these schools of fish. A lot of times, if you find the right little creek turn, the right little rock pile, or the right little bridge riprap, it can hold a huge school of fish because fish tend to group up during the winter time. So consequently, it's good when you find fish, but you got to cover a lot of water and cover a lot of dead territory before you find those honey holes. When I'm usually looking for corners of ripraps, I'm looking for that last little bit of deep water, a little small depression when I'm going in the back of a pocket or cove. That last little depression a lot of times will be where those fish will winter at. But anytime I can find a rock pile, a small depression, any of that, that's what I'm going to look for. So you guys, don't be intimidated by the cold temperatures. Fish will definitely bite a moving bait when the water dips into the 40s. I promise you, it can be some of the most successful fishing you'll have all year. So tie you on a trap, cover a lot of water, find those little depressions, little rock piles, those little inconsistencies that fish use in the winter, and you're going to catch a lot of fish, have a lot of success fishing traps this year.